Odell Beckham Jr. is a flamboyant person who lives a flamboyant lifestyle. As he says, people want to see the show. Odell Beckham Jr. presents himself in the same makeup as other superstars who have made millions of dollars and then fallen from grace. He makes a lot of money, but spends it furiously as well. Let's analyze and see where the money comes in, where it goes out to, and if Odell Beckham Jr. has it figured out so he can avoid being the next athlete on the front page of a newspaper with the caption, "Broke over his head." Does he have the financial acumen to manage this flamboyant lifestyle, or is he headed down the exact same path that we've seen so many others go through as well? OBJ entered the NFL in 2014, but didn't start really making the serious money until about 4 years later. Through his first 4 years in the NFL, he'd made just over $10 million. That's an average of $2.5 million each year. However, in 2018, it all changed. OBJ signed a 5-year contract extension with the New York Giants worth $65 million in guaranteed money and possibly worth up to $95 million with incentives being met. At the time, this made Odell Beckham Jr. the highest paid player at his position of wide receiver in the National Football League. This literally skyrocketed his earnings overnight. In 2018 alone, he made double in salary what he'd made combined the last 4 years. When judging Odell Beckham Jr., it is very important to consider how the money entered into his life and in what time span, because signing the biggest NFL contract for a player at your position can be both a curse and a blessing if not managed well. Like the story of a lot of lottery winners, his life must have felt like it changed completely when he put the pen to the paper. Let's also look at Odell's endorsements. He's the face of Head & Shoulders shampoo. He's got a 5-year shoe deal worth up to $29 million, but with extendable clauses to make the value potentially more than that. He's partnered with EA Sports, Xbox, Alienware, and the dog nutrition franchise ThinkJinx. All in all, it's estimated by most out there that Odell Beckham Jr. earns approximately $6 million more in addition to his yearly salary from endorsement. Estimating conservatively, Odell Beckham Jr. brings in about $20 million a year. That sounds impossible to spend through. However, we live in the real world and taxes are a thing. With Odell being in the highest tax bracket, we can estimate that by the time Odell has paid his fair share to Uncle Sam, he's left with about $11 million each year remaining. Now, Odell Beckham Jr. lives an extravagant lifestyle, to say the least. Let's talk cars. We're looking at an extensive collection with multiple Rolls Royces in his garage. Throw in a Lamborghini, Ferrari, a number of different Mercedes, a Jeep Wrangler he purchased for his sister, and trucks that he generously bought for his mom and dad. Odell Beckham Jr.'s car collection is not too dissimilar from a luxury auto dealership. The financial problem with most of Odell Beckham Jr.'s cars is that they are customized. While this can make for some sweet magazine photos and looks as he's rolling through the downtown streets of Cleveland, Ohio, it doesn't make for a good resale asset. To put it in perspective, luxury cars are already a highly depreciating asset in a market of cars which are already known as a depreciating asset. Add a customization to anything and it's going to be even harder to find a buyer who actually wants that specific car that you own. When Odell Beckham Jr. is through driving these cars, because they will all rust and fall apart and need repairs one day, not to mention the insurance, it's going to make it hard for him to flip these for anything close to what he paid for them. OBJ also has a collection of luxury watches. Most of these start at up to 6 figures a pop. Some luxury watches can hold their value, even appreciate, but most do not. Odell probably is not investing in watches as a way to earn money in the future. A lot of the watches that he owns is simply frivolous spending for the purpose of flexing on other NFL superstars. Odell is also a collector of shoes. He's got over 300 in his collection. He's got a fine taste for jewelry, which is an expensive collection and also is another depreciating asset with a low resale value. Customization applies for jewelry as well. Odell Beckham Jr. likes to travel. You look at his Instagram and you see pictures from all across the world. However, vacations and experiences, they are expensive and you certainly can't resell them back. I don't think that a lot of the trips Odell Beckham Jr. is taking are sponsored by any brand agencies. However, if I were advising him, since he likes to go all over the world and is not unwilling to do endorsements, why don't you partner up with one of these luxury travel brands and be the face to make a little bit of money, take some pictures which will be good for your media, and also get these trips paid for you and your crew of friends. However, Odell spends a lot of his off seasons in Italy, on fancy beaches, and in the best cities in the world, and traveling this much is going to be very expensive in the long run. Odell Beckham Jr. also owns at least one home in New York City. It's a $1.3 million home, which I actually believe is a great investment. And since he's been in New York playing for the Giants, if he's continued to own this property, it's almost assured that this property has gone up in value, so he'll be able to sell it for more than what he paid for. Real estate is almost always a good investment. Outside of his New York house, Odell Beckham Jr. is said to have rented a number of other properties. For his property rental in Cleveland, I consider this a great move because in his line of work, he could be traded overnight, and his location and flexibility needed with his housing situation could change almost instantly. It's not always good to lock yourself into a short-term, big, expensive house to buy, especially if you don't know when you may be forced to sell. Odell Beckham Jr. currently makes enough money to keep spending to maintain his lifestyle. However, a problem occurs when he continues to spend now, like his income stream will never change. And this is certainly not going to be true in the future. Risk is something that humans are notoriously terrible at evaluating. It's the old adage that I've seen other athletes go broke, but I know it won't happen to me because I am different. I can do the things that they did, but a different outcome will happen to me because I, for whatever reason, am special. Even if you sat down with Odell Beckham Jr. and had a conversation with him and he agreed that his future earnings will decline, a lot of times he will probably underestimate the risk that he's currently in, that his earnings may decline quicker than he would expect. There are four major factors in play going on that I don't think Odell Beckham Jr. properly accounts for when he looks at his risk tolerance that could come into play at any moment that would crash his earnings and his income stream. The first is superstardom, and this is often something he can't feel slipping away because he's in his own bubble. But Odell Beckham Jr. is no longer the NFL superstar that he was back when he was with the Giants and when he signed that mega contract in 2018. He's no longer talked about as the first thing on ESPN. He is no longer consistently the biggest player on his team even, and his production is starting to decline, which impacts how many reporters, how many media members, and how many brands really care about him. As people talk about you less and your superstardom declines, brands are much less likely to have you holding their dog treats, using their shampoo, or standing around wearing their sneakers. Injuries are another factor Odell has experienced personally. He tore his ACL last year, which took him off the national radar. Once you're injured, it's much more likely to get injured again, and this would be something that would really impact his future earnings on the field in the NFL. Finally, age is the factor that he cannot stop. He knows it's coming, but I'm sure he overestimates how long he'll actually be able to play at a high level. He's in his earnings prime right now at 28 years old. He signed that massive contract, but it's almost a guarantee with his age and the position he plays, he will never sign a contract even close to the second one he signed, which was the NFL record setter in 2018. I'm sure Odell sees himself playing successfully well into his 30s, but the reality is that few NFL stars make it productively past their 30th birthday. The clock is ticking on Odell, and he's not being helped out by any of the injuries he's had or the drop-off in production that we've seen recently on the field. So how can Odell Beckham Jr. avoid going broke? Well, one traditional method that a smart financial advisor would pitch to him would be a diversified portfolio of investments. Investments are key because if you've got money now, you can grow it over the long run and secure yourself a nest egg for the rest of your life. However, it appears that Odell Beckham Jr. is falling into the classic mold of a sports superstar who thinks of himself as a savvy tech investor. And unfortunately, a lot of times these stories do not work out as well as you'd hope. OBJ has taken some of his money and invested it into startup tech companies. He's invested in an esports investment fund and management company called Vision Esports. He's also invested in another round of funding for the asset management app Titan, which I've actually done a video on this channel. It appears in his free time, Odell has also tried to partner up and launch his own vitamin brand called Brand X. However, Brand X doesn't seem to be very successful as a vitamin and supplement company. It doesn't come up on the first page of a Google search. Its Facebook page has been inactive for almost a year, and the same story happens when you search for its Instagram page. It's very dubious if this is actually a viable business or if you can go and purchase anything from his vitamin company right now if you wanted to. The problem with the type of investing that Odell's publicized that he's doing is these are classified as angel investments. An angel investment is essentially where a business owner with a growing idea who needs cash goes to a cash source with a lot of money who can afford to throw them some money in return for the chance that they will get more money back if the company is one day successful. Angel investments hold a notoriously small percent chance of success. One study estimated that only between 5 and 10% of angel investments actually return any positive cash flow back to their initial investors. Another study pegged the ratio as even thinner, with about 1 in 30 angel investments actually panning out in any way. It's quite possible that for any of these 3 investments that Odell Beckham Jr. is throwing his money at, that he could see return in absolutely none of his areas and lose everything he's put in. So when do I believe that Odell Beckham Jr. will go broke? Sports Illustrated in 2009 did a revealing study on this exact case for NFL players. They concluded that by the time that NFL players have been retired for 2 years, 78% of former players have gone bankrupt or are under financial stress because of joblessness or divorce. Sports Illustrated cited 3 primary reasons to look for to see if an NFL athlete could go broke. Let's see how many Odell Beckham Jr., given what we know, checks. First of all, time horizon. NFL players are in a far shorter peak earnings potential than almost any other career that pays out millions of dollars. Odell Beckham Jr. is the perfect example of this, having signed a mega contract 4 years into his career, experiencing an injury, a drop in superstardom, and what looks for a tailing off in his earning. I think this checks that box. He's not going to have the time to appreciate how long it takes to actually grow money and the value of a dollar through hard work over a long time. He basically won the NFL version of the lottery. Area to look for number 2, risky investments. Odell Beckham Jr. has publicized that he wants to be a savvy business investor and that he sees his next success as being off the field of sports and on the field of business. However, Odell Beckham Jr.'s investments have been the angel type, which statistically just don't work out very well. I wish him the best of luck, and hopefully he hits it big on one of these ventures. However, does he really have the time to research these companies thoroughly or be active in the decision-making process so he has real input? I hope he's got some very, very smart people advising him and showing him the real risk and reward of what he's throwing his money into. Thing to look for number 3, purchasing liabilities instead of assets. I think between the cars, jewelry, watches, shoe collection, and customized vacations that he takes for himself, you could see that Odell Beckham Jr. is all about purchasing liabilities and is almost never about purchasing assets. He does have one house, which I'm sure appreciated in value, but there is a lot of frivolous spending that goes on when the money is coming in and it's going good for OBJ. When these assets start to depreciate, as they already have, and you need to replace them or you need to get rid of them, they're not going to be nearly as worth as much as what he paid, and that will be a very unpleasant surprise in a number of years. Odell Beckham Jr. certainly checks a lot of the boxes that you would be worried about from an athlete who may be on the path to going broke. He's a megastar now, but what happens when those checks stop being cashed? What will he turn to, and how will he be able to adjust his spending habits? At some point, he could spend so much money that it is too late and the things that you've bought just aren't worth as much as what you paid for them. Then you're in a real problem because you have spent your earnings potential, don't have a degree, and you've got to turn to a different way to make similar money that you did before to keep maintaining this lifestyle. That's the problem that a lot of high-profile athletes have run into. I hope he's got a well-diversified portfolio of investments that he promised himself he would set aside and never touch. But if he doesn't, he checks too many of the classic superstar going broke boxes that I'm worried that we may just see Odell Beckham Jr. broke only a few years after he's out of the NFL. As OBJ said himself, when the game is done with you, they chew you up, spit you out, you're done, you're done.